today we're going to talk a bit about doubt. It is often, kind of strikes me as funny how sometimes I sit down and go, okay, what encounter do I want to do? You know, what's the next thing? I mean, we've been at this for a year. And then my wife goes, hey, you know, I don't think I've ever heard anybody talking about Thomas. Maybe that would be a good encounter for you to discuss. And I'm like, okay. Yeah, I'm not really a fan of that because Thomas and I have a lot in common. But today we're going to traverse that mountain. And it's funny how even through the last week or so, as I've been preparing this, during the entire time, the number one thing I was dealing with was doubt. God, how am I going to deliver a message on doubt when I am struggling with doubt? Every time I walk up here and get the opportunity to share God's Word, it's a battle I face. Am I good enough? Am I going to say the right things? Am I going to, you know, and of course, as you hear, the premise of that is I. And then when I get here, somehow, some way, miraculously, God takes over. It was funny that even up to last night, I had finished the message yesterday. The wife was like, okay, you're going to preach it to me because I want to hear it and give you a chance to run through it. I said, I'm too tired. I said, we'll do this tonight. I said, when we get home, we went last night and watched the first 2 episodes released on The Chosen in the movie theater last night. Again, Pastor Todd and I were talking a little bit. You know, I'm always watching those movies or those shows with an eye of discernment. But I was captured by a section of that last night where Jesus is with his 12. And he is about to send them out. And he's going to go away for a little while. And so he gets ready and he's going through this process of selecting the 2 by 2 as he sends them out. And I don't know what happened in that room. It's a speculation, even for them. You know, what we do know is it's clear that Jesus said, I want you to go out 2 by 2. And he said, you know, don't bring anything with you. And if they don't accept you, dust the dirt off of your feet and get out of there. That's what Scripture is and it tells us. And the idea of that whole passage is just about the faith it took for those guys to go out and do that. But the interaction that you can imagine that happened, which is well thought out, I thought. Again, we don't have it in Scripture, but I could see how it could play out that way, was the look on these guys' faces when he told them, I want you to go out and cast out demons and heal the sick. Up to this point, the only person that could do that was God. And they play off of each other in there so well. I mean, some of the disciples are like, really? Heal the sick? Do you know who I am? What I saw that was prevalent through that entire somewhat humorous time was that one big word, doubt. How often are we confronted when God asks us to do something that we feel we're not capable of doing with doubt? Now we look at the word doubt and we think it might be a negative thing, right? Well, let's talk about a little bit before we get into the passage. What is doubt? Let's just go to a good old Miriam, right? What does Miriam say? Does anybody know if Miriam's a male or a female, a man or a woman? I hear the word Miriam and I think, well, let's listen to what she's got to say. But I don't know if that's correct or not. But Miriam says this: doubt is to call into question the truth. Makes sense. It's to be uncertain. It's also a lack of confidence in something. I look at that definition and go, maybe the word is not doubt, and maybe it's Jerry. As we get into and talk more about Thomas, you'll understand why. See, it's a feeling of uncertainty. However, doubt is neither good nor bad. We have a negative connotation of doubt because oftentimes when we doubt, there's a lot of other things that go on with it that take us kind of towards the negative side. But in and of itself, doubt is not good or bad. But what doubt is, when it becomes good or bad, is how you deal with the situation. What do you do with it? And the reality of it is, it's in everyone's life. There are no exceptions. Can anyone in this room say that there was not a time that they did not have doubt? Doubt can be one of the biggest enemies of a Christian. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like later. But that kind of sums up, from a worldly view or whatever you want to call it, what doubt is, kind of what we understand it to be. So, as I referred to it before, but let's talk about a little bit about who has doubts. But before we do that, let's go to the passage that I'm going to be referring to today. John chapter 20. And while the section is from 20, I think it's 24 to 29. 24 to 29. We're going to go back to verses 19. So John chapter 20, verses 19 through 29. And we'll talk a little bit about why I'm looking at those first verses, because it sets up some context that we need to understand. Let me know when anybody there? Good? Everybody? Cool. All right. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. And it begins like this. It says, "On the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said to them, 'Peace be with you.' And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. When the disciples were glad, the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, 'Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you.' And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, 'Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you withhold forgiveness from any, it is withheld.' Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe.' 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' Then he said to Thomas, 'Put your finger here and see my hands, and put your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe.' And Thomas answered, 'My Lord and my God.' And Jesus said to him, 'Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed.'" So who has doubts? Kind of alluded to that earlier. Everyone does. Part of the reason why I'm reading the previous passage is to set a little bit of the context of who had doubts. What are those doubts? What do we have doubts in? For me, my biggest one is I doubt a politician. I doubt I'm ever going to get the truth out of a politician. I don't care whether you're right, left, or up the middle. I don't care. For some reason, there's not been enough. What causes that? Well, track record for a lot of time. There's this thing called self-doubts. Ooh, that one hurts. Hurts me. I mean, I've never thought, if I walk through the life that I've walked through and some of the bad decisions that I've made and sinning against God, that He could even use me. So sometimes it's just self-doubts on the ability to do something. The ability maybe to have a relationship because of, you might not think you look good or whatever the case may be. There's so many doubts that can occur towards self-doubts. Then there's this thing called what I would call life doubts. It's the idea of, is life going to get any better for me? That struggle as you're coming out financially. You're working and bills, air conditioner breaks, all this stuff. Car breaks down. There's those doubts that creep in that, will I ever get out of this? Will it ever get any better for me? Has anybody ever had the doubt of, hey, God, I'm going to church. God, I'm serving on this ministry. God, I'm doing all of these things. Why is this happening to me? What is going on? There's that life doubts that you process through each and every day. And then there's this thing that it's hard to admit sometimes, but for me, self-doubt, is spiritual doubts. Have you ever been driving down the road? It's quiet, and you start thinking about, church, relationship with God, and ever had this thought pop in your head, am I doing all of this? And does it really exist? Is there really heaven? Was there this guy named Jesus who died on the cross for me? Am I good enough? All of these doubts creep into our lives. Thomas had these doubts. Here, Thomas, if we look at who he was a little bit, he's a bit of a pessimist. Many scholars talk about this, that during the time when Jesus talked about going to be with Lazarus, when Lazarus was sick and he was ill, this was a time that they not too long ago left that area and under the threat that Jesus would be killed. And so Thomas is like, yo, Jesus, what's up, man? You want to go back there? They're going to kill you. He's always this glass half empty kind of guy. And this is kind of why I can relate to who Thomas is, because I'm a glass. Yeah, there's liquid in my glass, but it's not full. Some people are thankful that they have a half a glass. I struggle with going, why isn't it full? I'm always going to find the thing that, even to some degree when I go, and we should have discerning eyes, and Todd and I were talking about this, but even when I go to like a movie like that or to a show or whatever, it's like I'm going to look to find what's wrong with it. What lie are they telling me? What untruth, or what did they exaggerate? I know what it's like to be that glass, and you know what? That glass half empty guy got a lot of doubts. It's kind of an easy target for me. And I think so it would be with Thomas as well. You see, but Thomas was also courageous. We don't often see that or think about that when we think about Thomas. We often think about, how in the world, Thomas, could you think the way you think and say the things that you say? We got to fix this. Wow, there we go. Thank you. Thank you. And I don't know, there we go. We'll get it back together. I will edit this out of the sermon. Oh, Lord. The Bible's upside down. I lost my page. Does anybody know where John is? It's in there. Oh, Lord. But, where did I lost my train of thought, too? Back to him being courageous. See, what we don't realize is John also had a bit of courage in him. Because see, in the same incident, in the same situation where he was glass half empty and warning Jesus about being, going back to the area where they really hated him, he also said this. He said, I will die with you. You see, Thomas was not just a guy who was a doubter. Thomas was a guy who was ingrained with devotion to Jesus Christ. You see, I think Thomas gets a bad rap. Because the reality of it is, the reason why I was reading this first section, and I'll refer to it here in just a second, is Thomas was not the only one at the time that had doubts. He was the one that seemed to be singled out, but he was not the only one that had doubts. You see, Jesus appeared to the disciples a week before, and Thomas wasn't there. But if you look at the encounter with the disciples, there are some similarities. And even Mark chapter 16, 10 through 13, it refers to, it's another account, it's Mark's account of this same appearance. While we focus on Thomas as being the one who's the doubting one, because that's the name he carries throughout generations, the reality of it is the disciples also doubted. And they were afraid. See, it wasn't like in John's occurrence, John may have a little different perspective. John talks about Jesus showed up, he says, peace be with you. Jesus shows his hands and his side to the disciples. The reason he did that is because the very same doubts that Thomas carried were the doubts that they had as well. They thought they were seeing a ghost. And the whole time, these 3 years that they spent with Jesus, Jesus was preparing them for this, and they had somewhat forgotten everything that Jesus had said. So what causes doubts? If doubt's not good nor bad in and of itself, then what really causes doubts? Venture to say, how about wrong expectations? See, I think Thomas suffered from this. Again, he's walking 3 years with Jesus. And Jesus, although he's telling them what's going to happen, I believe that Thomas felt like Jesus was going to be around a lot longer than he was. I don't know, the culture back then, the Jewish culture back then, they truly were looking for their Messiah, and that Messiah was going to be one who was going to take Rome out, was going to be their king. Maybe Thomas carried some of those ideas. But whatever it was, doubt is often caused by wrong expectations. Sometimes we set expectations too high. Have we ever had expectations of God that have gone unmet? It's not because of who God is, it's because of who we are. That is one of the root causes of doubt. You know, just to give an example of a wrong expectation of God. And sometimes it comes into the answer is delayed, but the reality of it is, for me, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago or more, 20 years ago, I don't remember how long it's been. That's what happens when you get old. I had a guy that basically poured into me. His name is Gerald Hicks. And I was serving as a youth pastor. And he looked at me and he says, you know what? You're called to serve God. He says, and you need to go to school. And so I went to Baptist College of Florida. Well, in Baptist College of Florida, I'm sure is probably not unlike many other Christian colleges or seminaries, you know, and everybody goes in and they have the expectation when they leave there with their degree, they are going to be serving full-time in ministry somewhere. That it's going to be a vocation. And so the whole time I'm going to school and I get out, once I get out, I'm like, okay, God, where's that church you want me to work at? This is the first time in 25 years that I've had the opportunity to preach on a regular basis. During that 25 years, I can tell you I doubted what God wanted me to do. So I can understand how Thomas could have some doubts because he may have had different expectations than what God's plan was. The other thing that causes doubt is fear. Have you ever been afraid and then started questioning? I don't know what goes through Tim and Todd's mind. I can only imagine. When they're here, they do a tremendous job of putting on a smile and encouraging us and loving us. But do you ever wonder what they go through when they're by themselves in that room? I can't speak for them. I can speak for myself. I can only imagine if I was in a similar situation, I'd have to doubt at times because I'd be afraid. See, fear is a huge driver in doubt. Why me, God? It can be because of illness. It can be financial. It can be, as we talked about earlier, the direction of our country. The fear could also be in foreign governments, as we see the news, as it seems like we could be on the precipice so close to a World War III because of all of the talk that's going on out there. But here's the deal. Whenever we get afraid, if we're not careful, it'll start causing us to doubt and doubt God. And isolation can be another cause for doubt. See, we don't know exactly where Thomas was. But what we do know was Thomas was not during this time with the other disciples. And we all know that isolation, it puts the biggest target on a believer for the enemy. See, I believe that Thomas, while he was trying to process all of this, and we remember back in it was back in Matthew 26:56, we see what happened to the disciples the moment that Jesus died or was arrested. They got out of Dodge. They were afraid. You know, the funny part of it is, and this just popped into my head, so this tells you how the Spirit works. It's awful funny how fear can take over one's life the moment Jesus is no longer in it. For those disciples, Jesus was taken away from them, and they instantly feared. The moment we step away from Jesus is the moment we're susceptible to fear and doubt. See, Thomas was not necessarily at the first appearance, but he was isolated and he was a target for the enemy. The cool thing is as you read here, when he comes back to the disciples, he talks about how the disciples were telling Thomas about Jesus' return the week before. But see, it was not just hey Thomas, how you doing? Man, we missed you. Man, oh, by the way, it was really cool. Jesus was here last week. No, they sat down with the tense, and again, I love looking into the Greek words. The tense of that word of the disciples telling Thomas was a future or a present tense. It was a continuous action. They were trying to convince Thomas that Jesus was really there, while Thomas was going, no, I'm not buying it until that man walks into this room and I can stick my fingers in the holes in his hands and stick my hand in the side. I am not going to believe. But what did it take to cure Thomas's doubt? What does it take to cure our doubt? Who showed up? See, when God comes in, I'm going to go a little bit out of order, only because the Spirit says go this route. When God comes in, here's the deal. He meets you where you are. Thomas was still where he was at in understanding and knowing and being able to be convinced that Jesus was really there. And Jesus showed up personally and met him where he's at. When you're struggling with doubt, when you're scared, he's going to meet you where you're at. See, when Jesus walked into the room, it wasn't, Thomas, what is wrong with you, dude? I have been telling you for the last 3 years this was going to happen. I don't understand why you don't believe me. Now, when Jesus walked into the room, he said this, peace be with you. You see, sorry. When we're messed up and we're doubting that God even exists at times, he understands where we're coming from. And instead of coming in like a dad who would scorn you, he comes in with his arms opened up. And he demonstrates his mercy. See, Jesus understood where Thomas was at. He knew that Thomas was doubting because Thomas had a hole in his heart because he had lost someone he loved dearly. And he was not going to condemn him for that. The other thing that cures doubt that we see in this passage is God's tangible love. See, for Thomas, it was the compassion and the mercy that Jesus had to say, put your fingers into these wounds. Stick your hand into my side. I love you enough that I want you to touch me. Jesus isn't here for us to touch. So what does that look like for us? When was the last time you were in one of those moments and it didn't quite turn out as bad as you thought because God stepped in? That's the tangible love we need to hold on to. We need to remember the things that God has done for us when we start doubting what He can do. So I want to wrap up with a couple things. Just as a reminder, it's okay. We're all going to doubt. Doesn't make you a bad person. Don't buy into the lies that if a Christian doubts, they're not a Christian. Or maybe they're weak. We're all in a battle. And doubt is just one of the enemies. I love what the brother said. I kind of tied it when he talked about, and he confessed in his prayer, and I talked about that whole eavesdropping thing on the prayer, was how he asked for forgiveness because of a veil was put in front of him of seeing God, the expectation that God had. See, doubt is that veil. Is one of those veils that blocks us from seeing who God can be. But that's okay, because God's going to meet us where we're at. Remember, doubt in itself is not a good thing, or it's not a bad thing. But it is what you do with it that makes it good or bad. Let me give you a couple examples. Good way. How doubt can be a good thing. It can make us stop and think if the thing that we doubt will help or harm us. Sometimes doubt is a red flag. It's just a warning to go, wait a minute, think about it. Doubt doesn't always have to be a bad thing. If you go through some of the churches today and you listen to some of the messages, if you get a red flag of doubt, you need to go check it out. Wow, that kind of rhymed. I didn't. But it can be that good thing to help you in your discernment. But in a bad way, it can keep us from experiencing all that God has for us. See, believing in what we cannot see also yields benefits. Jesus himself said that we will be blessed for those that do not see. Well, let me clear up a little misconception about this word blessed. Often many churches take it as, if I do this, then I'm going to get this in return. And somewhat leads to some of the poison that's in preaching today. Blessing is simply this. It is a contentment in God. It is the idea of sitting there and understanding and knowing that God has your back. Yet sometimes that comes in a monetary value. Sometimes it comes in just walking out feeling good. But I can bet you can talk to these two men in the back of the room when they're going through some of the darkest times of their life. And I bet you they can tell you times that they were the happiest during those times because they were living in the blessing of God. In the contentment of who He is. In the contentment of His mercy and His grace. Doubt left alone will be, not can be, will be destructive to your life. I can tell you, I can't count on the number of fingers how many times I've told my wife that whenever something significant was going on that was not so cool, that I wanted to just go crawl up in my bed, pull a cover over my head, and then wake up and hope it was gone. But the reality of it is it's not going to go away. And left unchecked, it will destroy your life. It has to be dealt with. And doubt that is dealt with can and will help us grow spiritually. See, the reality of it is when we deal with doubt and we go to God and we ask for Him to get involved, doubt, as a good thing, will draw us closer to Him. I know when I struggle and I'm having those thoughts, the first place I go, I don't turn ESPN on. I don't go watch a movie. I don't listen to some talk show. I go to God. Because I know that ultimately He's the one that's going to deal with it. And He's the one that's going to give me the peace that I need. Thomas did this. Once Jesus opened His arms and allowed Thomas to touch Him, He made that very profound statement, "My Lord and my God." He acknowledged who Jesus was at that very moment. Every believer, when they interact with doubt, needs to go to God for prayer.